So in this lesson, we'll look at macroeconomic equilibrium. So this is the actual shifts in the aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply, so that we begin to see an idea of when those shift, what's actually happening in the market, and as we move back towards potential GDP and how that GDP increases over time. So macroequilibrium occurs when aggregate demand equals aggregate supply. So if we have aggregate demand, we have aggregate supply, where those two intersect, that's macroeconomic equilibrium. Okay, now what's important here is real GDP demanded, that's demand, equals the quantity of real GDP supplied, so our aggregate supply line, at a specific price level. So in this graph, what we would be saying here is that our price level is about 148, our intersection point here, and that's going to create about 7.1 trillion in real GDP aggregate output. So where those two intersect is the aggregate output in the economy at each specific price level. But our graph is incomplete because we're not looking at long run aggregate supply. Remember, those two terms are not the same. So when aggregate demand equals short run aggregate supply and long run aggregate supply, then the economy is at potential GDP. So in other words, macro equilibrium is not exactly potential GDP. Rather, macro equilibrium is just where we're at this point in the market. Now, what we want to do is we want the market to trend towards potential GDP, towards the trend line, so towards long run aggregate supply, because that's our potential GDP point. That's also full employment in the economy. Remember, full employment does not mean 100% in terms of everyone has a job. Rather, it's just that's the point at which the natural rate of unemployment equals the unemployment rate in the short term that we see fluctuating. So everything along that point, those are what we see when we talk about that business cycle and the trend line. So everything that hits that trend line is potential GDP. And that's really what we're looking at, is an attempt to try to maintain points along the potential GDP curve. So everything that slides out here to the right, that equals an increase in potential GDP. So that's when real GDP is rising above potential GDP, whereas anything to the left is when real GDP falls below potential GDP. And so you can look at it here when we look at the smaller graph and bringing it from last lesson. Everything there in the red, where below the GDP, so that's when it falls below, and that's everything on the left. So whenever macroeconomic equilibrium is to the left of potential GDP, it's below the trend line. When it's to the right, it's above the trend line. And of course, neither one will stay there permanently. It's temporarily, but you can see how that creates those shifts in the short run business fluctuations around the trend line. So what we see is shifts in aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply that move the economy away from potential GDP. And then these are the fluctuations we see in the business cycle. And what to do is, of course, is anytime they move away, they'll naturally move back towards. It's just how long does it take? And that's when you start to look at the length of these dips and the length of these expansions over potential GDP. Okay, so we'll pull this up, look at a bigger example here. So we bring our three curves up, and so now we're at potential GDP. So macroeconomic equals potential GDP, so full employment is taking place within the economy. So from that standpoint, when we look at this business model graph that we did last time, we see the 2 points intersecting. So in this case, we're looking at the trend line. Now the question, of course, for us, we want to look at is this. So real GDP falls below potential GDP. So remember, anytime real GDP falls below potential GDP, we have a shift to the left. So one reason, aggregate demand, if it shifts to the left, then we fall into that red. We fall below potential GDP. So like that. So you'll notice in this case, price levels fell and the aggregate output fell as well. And so now we're in a position where we're in the red area. So anytime along those points there of the below the potential GDP, so that's where we're at. You can see here. Now the other issue would be is if short run aggregate supply shifts to the left, So if our green line here shifted left, obviously the same thing would occur. We would end up in a position where we're falling below potential GDP. Okay, so now in this one, we'll bring up our curves again. So here we have our three curves. We see where we're at potential GDP. Now, in this instance, we want to look at what causes us to rise above. So when we're looking at rising above potential GDP on our top right-hand graph up here, that's the area there in blue above the trend line. So you can see here, same place. So we're talking about if we were in this point, in other words, any point along the potential GDP line, of that trend line, that's what we're trying to get. So real GDP rises above potential GDP when one of two things happen. One is when aggregate demand shifts to the right. Two would be when short-run aggregate supply shifts to the right. In both of those cases, real GDP is going to rise above potential GDP. So you can see here, when our short-run aggregate supply shifts, now we're working at a rate above the potential GDP. In this case, we've seen a fall in price levels, but we've seen an increase in aggregate output. So potential GDP there, it's increased. So now we're operating somewhere along with this blue line above the potential. So that's really what's happening here is when it shifts, and we just want to look at what's going on in the economy when these shifts. That's really the entire point of this particular lesson. So we'll start by looking at long-run aggregate supply. So the position of long-run aggregate supply is not constant over time. It does shift to the left and to the right. So if you remember from the business model that real GDP and price levels are trending upward in the long term. So when we're talking about it, everything on that potential GDP, it's shifting to the right over time. That's what we're seeing from a business model perspective, is that long-run aggregate supply is going to slide out, because you can see it there, it's the trending upward over time. So that's what we're looking at. So this suggests that long-run aggregate supply shifts to the right over time, because if it's not shifting to the right over time, then we don't get this upward sloping trend line, because as it's doing that, price levels are also rising. So in both cases, as both of those rise over the long term, we see this trend line develop. So it shifts over time. The question, of course, is why does it shift? So when we talk about why is it shifting to the right, so reasons for shifting the long-run aggregate supply. One would be increasing population of the U.S. causes long-run aggregate supply to shift to the right, and that's true because long-run aggregate supply, remember, that's the factors of production over time, which the price levels don't change. So for example, when we see population increases within the United States, what we're seeing, of course, is an increase in the amount of labor that's available. So early 19th century, late 19th century immigration, basically old immigration and new immigration that we talk about in an American history class. In both cases, what that did is that brought working class individuals into America. Now, the old immigration workers there tended to be basically shop owners and skilled labor, whereas what came over after the Civil War was a lot more unskilled labor. But in both cases, that influx of labor caused the long-run aggregate supply curve to shift to the right. So it's because we're seeing here is an increase in the supply of labor. Now, this creates a quantity of goods and services increased. And so in 1880s, the population of Poland fell as people immigrated to the United States. The U.S. long-run aggregate supply shifted to the right, while Poland's actually shifted back to the left because their population of working-age individuals fell. So when we talk about the shifts in long-run aggregate supply, they're a result of changes in the factors of production. For example, changes in population and minimum wage can both affect the supply of labor. Increased minimum wage affects the natural rate of unemployment, which also represents full employment. The thing about that is if unemployment were to increase, if the minimum wage increases, it could cause the unemployment rate to rise. Well, that would change the natural rate of unemployment then. So an increased minimum wage would cause unemployment to rise. And this would reduce the output of goods and services produced, thus shifting long-run aggregate supply to the left. Increased capital as a rightward shift in LRAS is also interesting because it can be both financial or human capital. So, for example, if you have an increasing graduation rate among high school students and improving college graduation rates, that would increase long-run aggregate supply. It would shift to the right. Now, the reason for that is very simple because as the population becomes more skilled, in this case our human capital, then that allows us to see an increase in human capital. Thus, we see the increase in long-run aggregate supply. Another issue here, like for example, 1948 California gold rush and the 1860 discoveries of silver in Comstock, Nevada, both of these shifted long-run aggregate supply as well, because discoveries of new resources thus increase the economy's ability to produce goods. And to give you the best example I can of this, is something you worked on the very first unit in this class, which was the production possibilities curve. So when we take that and we compare and say, how does that factor in with long-run aggregate supply? So here's our original production possibilities curve. So what happens, of course, is the discovery of new resources increases the amount that which producers could push out of the two goods in competition that we use in our fake model here. So let's look at what happens. So when the discovery of new resources occurs, we see that production possibilities curve expands outward. Now we can all of a sudden produce more goods and services. As a result, of course, the long-run aggregate supply shifts out to the right. So same thing, we see another shift, new discovery of materials, new technology, creating another shift. And once again, we have another shift. And so what's happening, of course, is as the production possibilities curve expands outward, well, it expands outward because people are finding a more efficient way to produce goods, or they're finding more resources with which to produce from. In both cases, the PPC is going to expand outward, which of course means for us that so will long-run aggregate supply. It's going to shift outward over time for multiple factors that you see here. So, more important than natural resources, though, is technology's impact on the long-run aggregate supply. So, it's the largest reason for that rightward shift. So, when we look at long-run aggregate supply, since the Industrial Revolution, technological advancements have continuously increased in this shift. So, to give you an idea, so let's say here's the long-run aggregate supply before the Industrial Revolution. Well, when steam engines were developed, then we see an increase. The reason why, of course, is because the engines allowed us to automate a part of the work in the style of work. And all we had to do was to create plants along the riverways. And all of a sudden now, textile industry went from being produced within homes in a domestic system into an actual factory system in which people went into work every day. They ran the machinery. They did various things with machinery, with technology, to improve the amount of textiles they could produce. Another one, electricity, for example, late 19th century, Thomas Edison, his electricity. Now all of a sudden, factories didn't have to work just during the day. They could also work at night. So what do we see? We see a rightward shift in long-run aggregate supply. Standardized parts with Henry Ford, once again, we see a shift. In other words, when we see significant technological advances, we see shifts in aggregate supply to the right, because that allows us to produce more of goods. So we see that it's going to shift rightward over time. Now, technological developments plus increasing population ensure that the long-run aggregate supply shifts to the right over time. So we see those two factors are involved in generating this shift and then creating, of course, this increasing amount of potential GDP that's possible. So the other side of this coin, though, is that inflation also occurs in the long run. Over the long run, we see an increase in prices. An analysis of historical CPI data reveals that, in other words, all we have to do is look at CPI to determine that price levels are increasing over the long time period. So aggregate demand fluctuates, but it trends upward over the long run. So to give you an idea, you can see right here how it's been trending. Price levels have been steadily increasing, and then since 1971, they've increased even more significantly. So price levels steadily increase over time. Now the average rate of inflation is 3.22%, which means that the average amount of inflation per year, the average increase in prices per year is 3.22%. Since 1913, prices have risen 2,275%. So just think about that for a moment. How much prices have risen in that time? So the question, of course, is why? What in the world's going on that all of that inflation occurs? Well, there's increases in the money supply. That's what creates it. In other words, there's more money in the economy now than there was in 1913. As a result, prices have increased. And so this is kind of the focus of our next unit, is we're going to look specifically at this increasing in the supply of money, this increase in our trend line, and looking at how these two create this equilibrium along with short run aggregate supply. So how does a shift in aggregate demand affect macroeconomic equilibrium? So that's one of the questions we're going to have to answer. So remember that a change in price level causes a movement along the aggregate demand curve. So when we pull the curve up, we can look at it like this, and we notice that if an increase in price levels, that would create a decrease in aggregate output. And then shifts in aggregate demand occur because of changes in the components of GDP. So when we go from 1 to 2, we know what's happened is essentially there's been a change in a component of GDP. So whether that change was in consumption, investment, government purchases, or net exports, we know there was a change that occurred. So these changes occur because of three primary factors that we looked at: expectations, fiscal and monetary policy, and world economic situation, or exchange rates. So in the long run, the supply of money is increased. And so we know that this money supply is going to increase, whether it's because of monetary policy with the Federal Reserve, or if it's a result of credit cards and loans that we're going to talk about. So this causes aggregate demand to periodically shift to the right, intersect with the long run aggregate supply curve, which is vertical. So you see how these intersect with each other over time. And then we can notice that equilibrium, of course, is increasing. And so we see that over time, what we notice, of course, is this increase in price level and an increase in aggregate output. So there's both of these are increasing. And so one of the things that we're going to look at within this lesson is specifically how that occurs and the importance of that. So let's look at the long-term economic developments. What's happening over a long span of time? So what we know, of course, is we've got our long-range aggregate supply, which is always vertical, of course, because price levels don't affect the factors of production in the long run. And then we have aggregate demand. Now, what we know, of course, is that in the long run, both of these two are going to increase over time. So then we have our short-run aggregate supply, and we'll talk about what happens with it in the process. So to begin with, we have this first equilibrium here, which is at a price level of around 120, and 3 trillion is our real GDP. And then we have a shift in the long-range aggregate supply for some reason, with technological advancement, of course. So when that shifts, notice that now we have the LRAS and we have SRS, and so there's those. At the same time, though, when we have that shift over time, the other thing we see is that aggregate demand shifts as well. And that creates a new point on potential GDP. So if we look at the first one, in the first one we saw that the price level at LRAS was 120. And now over time it's going to increase and it's going to become 140. And the reason for that is that aggregate demand will shift over time as the supply of money increases. So long range or long run aggregate supply, it increases as a result of population increases in financial or human capital, the development of or discovery of new resources, technological change. So that's why it's increasing. And then aggregate demand, it increases as a result of increases in the money supply.
So when we look at the third one out here, we see the shift again. So we have another shift in a new equilibrium, and now price level has increased to about 165, and we're looking at about 9.8 trillion in real GDP. Now, I've got these three shaded areas here, and the reason why I did that is because it's helpful to look at it. When you look at the first LRAS1, to the left is going to be declines. This is going to be when real GDP is below potential GDP. And on the other side, the right shaded area is an increase. This is when real GDP rises above potential GDP. So same thing there with the green. We see the negative on the left and we see the positive on the right. Same thing on the other one. We have this negative and this positive. In other words, what's happening is over the long term, LRAS is shifting to the right, AD is shifting to the right. In between that, during the short run, we see fluctuations happening within those shaded areas. That creates that business cycle that we're used to seeing, where we see a rise and we see a fall above and below potential GDP along the trend line. Now, short run short run aggregate supply will not change. It'll remain the same because the price levels and the factors of production remain the same. So there's nothing for it to do. So long run AS shifts over time as technological process, human and financial capital increases, new resources are discovered, and population increases. So it increases the natural output of goods and services. And remember what we saw just a second ago is we can take that production possibilities curve, and as that is inflated outwards, that's when we see these shifts in long run AS. Now, aggregate demand shifts to right over time as Feds increase the money supply and because of monetary policy, which increases the money supply indirectly. In the short run, AS will stay the same as both LRAS and AD both increase. So you can see what's happening in the long term. So over the long run number of years, a century, a couple centuries, this is what is going on within the economy, is we see this steadily increasing price levels, and you can look back at the CPI charts to see that. You can look at real GDP to see the growth in long run aggregate supply. So we can visually see what this looks like. So when LRS, SRS, and AD intersect, the economy is at potential GDP. And that's what we talk about. Potential GDP, of course, is also going to equal full employment. So one of the things about this shift you'll notice is that as long run aggregate supply shifts, we also see an increase in in full employment and the number of individuals within the workforce. So in between the shifts in LRAS, AD and SRAS will fluctuate. So in between those shaded areas, that's when you see fluctuations. This causes real GDP to fall below potential GDP or causes real GDP to rise above potential GDP. So this graph is one of the most important ones that we'll talk about simply because this explains what happens in the economy over the long term and then in between what happens in the short term. So we continue with the fluctuations in the business cycle, and there's some key things you need to remember. So shifts in aggregate demand or short run aggregate supply that move equilibrium to the left of LRAS creates real GDP falling below potential GDP. So anytime a shift in aggregate demand or short run aggregate supply causes equilibrium to move to the left of the long run or the left of potential GDP, real GDP falls below potential. Now, shifts in aggregate demand or short run aggregate supply that move equilibrium to the right of the long run cause real GDP to rise above potential GDP. In both situations, it is a temporary change. So macroeconomic equilibrium can happen in various places within the economy, and it's shifting. So macroeconomic equilibrium is just where AD and SRAS are intersecting. So macroeconomic equilibrium can happen either in front of or behind the long run, causing us to see a rise or a fall in the real GDP in comparison to potential GDP. So full equilibrium employment is AD equaling SRS equaling LRAS. So when those three are all intersecting, that's when we see full equilibrium employment. below full employment equilibrium, and then we have above full employment equilibrium. So we have three situations in which equilibrium can occur. So full economic equilibrium, then below full employment, which would be to the left, or above full employment equilibrium, which is to the right. So the first situation we're going to look at is below full employment equilibrium. So whenever aggregate demand or short-run aggregate supply deviates from full employment equilibrium. So in other words, if aggregate output deviates from potential GDP, and we're talking about in this sense to the left. So if aggregate demand shifts to the left, what happens? Okay, so here we have our long-run aggregate supply, our potential GDP. So here's aggregate demand and here's our short run. So what we're going to look at is a leftward shift. So here's equilibrium in red. This is our full employment equilibrium. When AD shifts and becomes here, notice what's occurred now. The economy is now, real GDP is below potential GDP. So now we have a new equilibrium. So notice in our new equilibrium, our price level is about 128. Whereas in our original equilibrium at full employment, it was more like 138. So we have a fall in the price level. At the same time, we went from 6 trillion in real GDP aggregate output down to 4 trillion in aggregate output. So we have the fall here in our aggregate output, and we have a fall here in price levels. So in other words, the price levels have fallen, so they've deflated. And of course, if you remember Phillips' curve, you should remember what happens when we see deflation in the economy. So when aggregate demand shifts to the left, aggregate output falls below potential GDP. Price levels fall, and it results in a rise in unemployment. Because when price levels are falling, that's a deflating currency. Remember, whenever the currency is being deflated, money becomes more valuable, and thus people spend less of it. And that's one of the things that we're seeing here is as you take money out of the economy, the value of that dollar rises. And so people are a little more selective in their spending. We see a fall here. So we see this fall in price levels. So in our second example, we'll look at the leftward shift in short-run aggregate supply as opposed to aggregate demand. So we'll bring up our graph. And so here we are. And of course, this is our full employment equilibrium where our red dot is. So what happens when our short-run aggregate supply shifts? So you'll notice when it shifts, what happens is we see the creation of a new equilibrium. Now, where price levels were at 128, notice what's happened now. Price levels have risen from 128 to 138. Now, at the same time, we still see the fall in aggregate output. It fell from 7 trillion to 5.3 trillion. And price levels, of course, were increasing. So when SRAS shifts to the left, aggregate output falls below potential GDP and unemployment increases. At the same time, price levels rise. So here's a really bad situation. And you'll notice in this situation, if you think about it for a second in terms of Phillips' curve, this runs contrary to what happens within the situation of Phillips' curve. We see a rise in unemployment and a rise in price levels. So this is a particularly bad situation within the economy. An example of this that we'll talk about is when we look at the 1970s and what occurs in the 70s in terms of historical fiscal policy, we see for the first time really that the economy, that this is what happens in the economy, and Phillips' curve is being deviated from, and it creates a real difficult situation in terms of how you fix this problem. So let's look at our two situations here with above full employment equilibrium. The first being a rightward shift in aggregate demand. So in this situation, when aggregate demand shifts to the right, what we see, of course, is we move from full employment equilibrium here with the red. We see the shift, and now we have an above full employment equilibrium. So in this situation, what we're noticing is with our new equilibrium is that we see an increase in prices. So our price levels rose and aggregate output rose. So we had a rise in inflation. We had an increase in aggregate output, which means that we have a decrease in the unemployment rate. This is that Phillips curve situation. So price levels rise And that's that sticky price theory Phillips curve. In other words, this is something we frequently are seeing in the economy, is that we see a shift in aggregate demand to the right. That's our Phillips curve situation. So an increase in the supply of money, which would cause aggregate demand to shift to the right, causes people to spend because the prices are low under the sticky price theory, and aggregate output thus increases. So in our second example, we have a rightward shift in short-run aggregate supply. So we'll bring our graph back up. So what we're looking at now, of course, is we have our full employment equilibrium is here. And then we see a shift in short-run aggregate supply, and we see a new equilibrium. This is a full employment equilibrium. So now we're looking at a situation in which employment rises. So price level was at 128. It then fell to about 119. So price levels fail. We had deflation occurring within the economy. Yet aggregate output increased, so employment increased. So here's a situation again that violates the basis of Phillips curve. Because when short-run aggregate supply shifts to the right, aggregate output rises above potential GDP. We see that price levels fall and employment rises. And we're going to really look next into exactly what is going on in the economy when this shift occurs and how it moves back to potential GDP. So in this situation, when we look at the fact that any deviation of real GDP, aggregate output, away from potential GDP is temporary. The economy is always going to move back towards full employment. Now, it may take a while, but that's what it's going to do. And it may not stay there for long, but it will always move back towards full employment. So when real GDP exceeds potential GDP, an inflationary gap occurs. And an inflationary gap is the amount by which real GDP exceeds potential full employment GDP. So it creates a gap between basically the potential, in other words, full employment, and then real has risen above that. So it's created a gap, and because it's an inflationary gap, it's a gap caused by a price increase. So inflationary gaps occur because of shifts in aggregate demand to the right. Okay, so an inflationary gap is an increase in price levels. So it's a rightward shift of aggregate demand. So it occurs when aggregate demand shifts to the right and demand exceeds supply. So there's a shortage within the market. So the rightward shift of aggregate demand is a result of the Federal Reserve adopting an expansionary monetary policy. And our next unit is on the Federal Reserve, so we'll look into detail about what that really means. So when the supply of money in the economy increases, it causes the quantity of real GDP to increase, creating an inflationary gap. And the result is a decrease in the buying power of wages since price levels increased. Workers are demanding higher wages and get them because real GDP demanded exceeds real GDP supplied. So here's what you have to understand. When this occurs, the buying power of wages decreases because of the inflation. This is what happens when the price levels increase. All of a sudden now there's more money in the economy, so each dollar is worth less. So the buying power of wages has fallen. And workers are able to get higher wages because of the shortage and the fact that they need to produce more of the good. So nominal wages are increasing. So as nominal wages rise, aggregate supply begins to decrease. So in other words, that shortage that we were seeing is kind of disappearing. So as nominal wages rise, aggregate supply begins to decrease, eventually shifting back towards full employment equilibrium. So let's look at this inflationary gap and see how it looks visually, what's really happening. So remember that potential GDP is when the three of these mix together. So that's when they're all equal, and that's when full employment equilibrium occurs. So that is this situation here. So this is where we originally start. Now aggregate demand shifts to the right, creating above full employment equilibrium right here. So now we have a situation in which we've seen a rightward shift in aggregate demand, and we have a new above full employment equilibrium. So with the increase in price level, purchasing power for laborers declines. So they ask for wage increases. So you can see here how price levels have increased. So there's that gap. You can see the gap that's created that triangle there, that would be your gap, your inflationary gap. So we have an increase in price levels. So because real GDP demanded exceeded real GDP supplied, firms increased wages to maintain output levels. So in order for them to produce more goods, they have to increase their cost of production by paying of their workers more money. So you can see here it goes from 8 to 10 trillion in terms of aggregate output. So as wages begin to rise, aggregate supply begins to decrease. Now this is the thing, so aggregate demand originally shifted to the right, but what's going to happen, of course, is that the aggregate supply will begin to decrease as wages rise, because as wages rise, firms, of course, are having to pay more workers more money. So what do they start to do? They start to eliminate some of the workforce. So it falls backwards, it shifts to the left. And all of a sudden now we see a situation in which the economy has moved back into full employment equilibrium. So whereas the aggregate demand shift out to the right, it increased employment. Eventually, once that shortage began to clear up, they fired those workers and the short run aggregate supply shifted back to the left. So this brought real GDP back to where it equals potential GDP, but at a higher price level. So here's what you have to understand, and this is the key here. An inflationary gap, the end result is still full employment equilibrium, but at a higher price level. You can see here, we see this shift occur, one shift and then the second shift, and that causes our long range aggregate supply to remain the same, but we see this increased price level. So you can kind of see our situation as to what's going on here with our inflationary gap. So whenever an inflationary gap occurs, remember it's the result of aggregate demand shifting out to the right. So now shortage has been created in the market. So because there's a shortage because of the price increases, the firms respond by paying workers more and hiring more workers. So aggregate output increases out to that amount. So they have to increase aggregate output to reach that amount. Now once they do that, of course, though, there's no shortage in the market anymore. And so now it begins to fall back. And so as aggregate supply begins to shift left back towards full employment equilibrium, the ultimate problem here is that now we have this increased price level. So ultimately we have an inflationary gap, and you can see that blue right there in the middle, right in here. That's that inflationary gap ultimately creating an increased price level. Our second situation that we deal with is called positive supply shock. So when aggregate demand is equal to AS1, if we have is equal to potential GDP, that's where we start with. So that's our starting point, is right there, our full employment equilibrium. In this situation, aggregate supply shifted to the right, out to here. So when this occurs, what we see, of course, is a fall in price levels, creating above full employment equilibrium. So price levels have fallen. Because price levels have fallen, people buying more. We see that, of course. We see an increase in the aggregate demand from 8 to 9.5, more or less. So they have to hire more workers. Now the excess aggregate supply means prices have dropped because now we have a surplus in the market. So you see the drop in prices. Real GDP supplied exceeds real GDP demanded. You can see what's happened here. We see the increase in output. So eventually aggregate demand will shift to the left. So eventually aggregate demand will respond and it will fall. And you'll see that we're creating now a new full employment equilibrium, but it's below, it's a lower price level. So as the excess aggregate output diminishes and real GDP will equal potential GDP. So in other words, as that surplus in the market disappears, as it's bought up, aggregate demand will then fall, and leading to the new full employment equilibrium. It's just at a lower price level. So you can see here what we have as our first is our shift out, then we have a shift back with aggregate demand. And so that creates the gap there, but it's the lower price level. So it's a positive supply shock. So a rightward shift in short-run aggregate supply is called a positive supply shock. A reason for this to occur could be like a drop in input price, say for the example of oil. So if input prices fall, and this is one of the things we talked about, then that means that producers can supply more at the same price. And so that's what happens. Now that creates a surplus in the market temporarily. And as that surplus is bought up, then of course demand levels will then fall back to potential GDP. So when the price of oil drops, firms can increase the supply of real GDP with increases in price, and the result is a decrease in price level and an increase in real GDP demanded. Okay, so our third here is a recessionary gap. Now, if we had an inflationary gap and it was a aggregate demand shifting to the right, then you can assume the recessionary gap is aggregate demand shifting to the left. So a recessionary gap exists when real GDP falls below potential GDP. So as you can see here, when we set this up, here we are at full employment. Now this is caused by a Federal Reserve undertaking a contraction of the money supply. So whenever money is removed from the economy, aggregate demand will shift to the left. So you'll notice we see the fall in prices. So the result is a decrease in price levels and a reduction in real GDP demanded. So you can see our situation here. We have a falling price level. At the same time, we see this decrease in our aggregate output, which went from 8 to about 5.8. So since real GDP supplied exceeds real GDP demanded, firms reduce output and employment until the surplus is eliminated. So once again, we see a surplus of product. When price levels fall, we see this surplus of the good. So how do the firms deal with the surplus? Well, they lay off workers. They reduce production levels until that surplus no longer exists. So then aggregate supply begins shifting to the right as the economy moves back towards full employment equilibrium. So once that surplus is eliminated within the market, notice that surplus, their short run slides to the right, creating a new full employment equilibrium, but at a lower price level. So you can see here our shift. So in the long run, the policy undertaken by the Federal Reserve lowered price levels only as the long run aggregate supply remained the same. And that's what you'll notice every time. Long run aggregate supply is remaining the same because we're looking at a short run issue. So this is in that business cycle when real GDP falls below potential. One of the reasons why could be a shift in aggregate demand. And you see what happens within the economy when that occurs. Employers will lay off workers until that surplus has been eliminated, and then things will begin to shift back towards full employment equilibrium. Okay, so let's look at adverse supply shock. So originally AD1, of course, our potential full employment, ADAS and then the LRAS are all equaling the same here at full employment equilibrium. So aggregate supply shifted to the left. So this is an unusual situation in the economy when the aggregate supply shifts to the left. Because you'll notice what happens. This caused price levels to rise and real GDP to fall below potential GDP. So look what happens. Price levels increase, so inflation occurs, and unemployment rises as well because workers are being fired. So this is an unusual situation. Wages are above equilibrium, so nominal wage has increased. And firms are firing workers because of the pressure on wages. Essentially, what happens is nominal wages have increased. So now all of a sudden the labor is too high of a production cost. So what do you have to do? You have to fire workers. You have to reduce the number of workers you have to bring that cost down. But when you do that, it puts pressure on productivity because now you have less workers who have to produce in a more efficient amount. So downward pressure on wages, upward pressure on productivity. Fewer workers have to maintain output because of the fact that wages increased and you had to fire some because you couldn't just cut wages. So as wages fall, productivity increases and aggregate demand shifts to the right. And the reason why the productivity increases is because of the production function. When you've reduced the number of employees, the number of work they can get done because they're not getting in each other's way could actually increase. So we can see an increase in production by getting rid of workers. Remember, this is that whole diminishing marginal return. So if we work backward off of that, we can increase productivity by reducing the amount of labor. And this is exactly what happens. So aggregate demand shifts to the right because now, of course, there's goods to buy. So as the number of employees is gone, efficiency increases and production increases. That then allows consumers to begin purchasing again, and so aggregate demand shifts to the right because of the increased purchasing. Now you'll notice, of course, that what happens is we see this increase in prices. And because once we fall back to full employment equilibrium, price levels have increased. So ultimately what happens here is we see that inflation will occur in the economy. We're going to see unemployment rise along with inflation. And ultimately when we finally come out of this situation, price levels have risen even higher just to get us back to the original full employment. Now, in our next lesson, our next unit, we're going to talk about the Federal Reserve, and we'll look at the banking system, which explain to us the shifts in the aggregate demand because of the increase and decrease in monetary policy and the money supply.